So, welcome to Take or Give, the podcast where we give you a backstage pass to the aid and international development sector and where we explain exactly how the sector works beyond what you might read in the newspapers, what you might see on social media, or even on TV. I'm Lorriann. I'm the founder and director of a political consultancy called The Advocacy Team.
And I'm Alex. I'm an independent researcher, advocate, and actor working in the sector.
And welcome to Series 1. We're delighted to be your co-hosts. So we are going to break down the development sector by busting some of the key myths that prevail. So we'll outline the myths, we'll explain why they exist, and we'll also explain why ultimately we think these myths are false.
That's right. So in episode 2, we gave you as concise an explanation of the aid and development sector as humanly possible. It was a tall order, but I'm afraid we're facing an even bigger one in today's episode because we're tackling our first big myth. And this one is very widespread. So myth 1 is basically this. Countries that receive aid money are entirely 100% responsible for their own problems. So basically, when rich countries give money to so-called poor countries, well, it's just charity. Because those countries are responsible for the challenges they're facing in the first place, whether that be poverty, inequality, the effects of the climate crisis, global health crises, and much, much more. So we want to be really upfront with you from the beginning of this episode. We, as your co-hosts, stand very firmly behind the fact that we simply cannot explain the entirety of current day challenges that countries across Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean face without looking at both the historical legacies that include enslavement, domination, colonization, and colonialism, and to top it off, modern day systems that maintain inequalities, for instance, through international trade systems, global financial systems, etc.
So in this episode, we're focusing primarily on the historic legacies and injustices that go all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade, which saw enslavement and resistance of people from Africa as early as the 15th and 16th centuries.
Okay, so you might already be thinking to yourself, well, what connection could that possibly have with foreign aid today, hundreds and hundreds of years later? We ask you to keep an open mind as we listen to an expert who has a very fresh and a very important take on this question.
Yes, and having heard Marcus on a number of interviews over the last few months, I can think of no one better to really explain this issue to our audience. So let me just introduce Marcus Ryder, the CEO of the film and TV charity. Marcus has spent his career of over 25 years working in media outlets across the world, including the BBC's. He's won numerous industry awards and is well known for his commitments to helping underrepresented groups and voices to work in the media, both on and off the screen. He too hosted a podcast with Sir Lenny Henry called Black British Lives Matters. Alex and I were regular viewers and listeners. And he's also recently co-authored a book, The Big Payback, The Case for Reparations for Slavery and How They Would Work, published in October 2025, available to use with your Amazon gift vouchers you may have received over Christmas. Welcome, Marcus.
Thank you so much. Lovely to be invited on.
Thank you. And I have to say, and I truly mean this, Marcus, I devoured this book in a couple of sittings. And it really resonated because it actually reminded me of what we're trying to do with this podcast, which is take really big, very, very misunderstood questions and make them accessible for a public audience. So listeners in our case and readers in yours. So the book really inspired us to explore our very first myth because The Big Payback tackles an issue that is very closely related, which is reparations for slavery. So Lorriann, I know you've got some questions for Marcus.
So yeah, let's start at the top. Why did you write The Big Payback and what were you hoping to achieve with the book?
Okay, so wrote The Big Payback with Lenny Henry. It's the third book that I've co-authored with him. And it's one of those ones where always write or what you want to read. And there isn't a book out there like that. And so I wanted a book that simply explained reparations, which is such an important subject, but in easy, accessible way. So the way that you introduced it, Lorriann and Alex, is is perfect. It's music to my ears because I wanted a book that you could read simply, that wasn't too taxing and was able to explain those big issues. Because I wanted to read that book. There are lots of books out there, many, to be honest with you, that we draw on in writing this book, and we spoke to experts who, I'm being honest, are far more knowledgeable about reparations than me. But sometimes they're a difficult read, and so I wanted something which was a bit more accessible because it is such a an important subject. And the reason why I really wanted to write it with Lenny, and there's lots of personal anecdotes in there and jokes, and by Lenny because he's a comedian as well, um, was because we wanted to make sure that it reaches a broader audience. Because the issue that I have with some of these books or podcasts is that there are lots and lots of great material out there, but we're kind of speaking to ourselves. We're preaching to the choir, we're preaching to the converted. And so what we wanted to do is make sure that, or the goal was to make sure that it could reach a wider audience as well. People that normally would think reparations isn't for me, or if it was, they'd pick up a book and wouldn't get past the first chapter. So it's trying to reach a wider audience as well. And Lenny is a national treasure. If the people who are listening to this in the UK will definitely know Lenny Henry. People outside of the UK who are listening to the podcast, he is this one of the few black British actors and comedians from the 1970s and 80s and even the 90s that really crossed over to a broader audience.
Very well said. And that's something that really stands out about this book. I would say the format is pretty much unique, actually. And you said, Lenny Henry is a comedian. It seems like a strange thing to say about a book of a subject this serious, but there are some laugh out loud moments. It's truly engaging. There's dialogue between you. And I was going to ask why you chose to write it in this way, but I think you've just outlined it there, that anybody, and I really mean anybody, can pick this up and understand it. And so we have a lot to learn from you, because that's what we want from the podcast.
The big question that we want to tackle today is, what would reparations mean or look like if they were successful? And how do you think that would be different to today's mainstream international development aid and assistance?
Ooh, okay, that's a really good question. So I think in broad brushstrokes, when we're thinking about reparations, there are two types of reparations we should think about, which is state to state, which is absolutely critical. And so when you see state to state, you're seeing Germany's reparations to Israel, for example. You're hearing state to state reparations when people are discussing reparations to Ukraine right now. And state to state reparations are absolutely critical. And we can talk about what that means or how we do that. Often it's cancellation of debt. It can be large money transfers. It can be different abilities to borrow money. So we can look at the Bretton Woods agreements and those institutions and standard lending rights, standing drawing rights. Right. So lots of state to state stuff. And then what we also need to look at is state to individual. So when we're looking at that, we've got examples which I've got in the book of Britain giving money to individuals with regards to the Mau Mau in Kenya. You also have state to individuals of Germany giving to individuals in parts of Africa, and I forget the African state, has gone clean out of my head right now, but the atrocities that they committed as well. So you can have state to state and state to individuals, and both are really important.
Just based on what you've stated there, it's about looking backwards in order to look forwards. To me, that's one of the main distinctions with foreign aid, because foreign aid sort of takes the status quo as a given. They say, well, who cares how we got here? We're here now, and so now we're going to give money as a charitable form of giving to help solve those problems. So I see that as one of the main distinctions. There are many others. Is there anything else you want to say about that? How foreign aid today looks very different to what successful reparations of the kinds that you're describing there would look like. What are those key distinguishing features?
So I think the most important thing for me in the difference is actually in the word reparations. So reparations comes from the Latin, which is I think reparare, which is basically means to repair, right? And so it's an acknowledgement that something has broken, rather than just seeing the poverty that African countries or Caribbean countries and other lesser developed and middle income and low income countries have as just being a almost like an act of nature, an act of God. They are broken and something needs to be repaired. There's damage has been done. Damage was committed by European countries, and that repair needs to be made. And so once we acknowledge that repair needs to be made, we then have to look at in what form does that repair need to be made. And so there's the idea of restitution. So what would have happened and where would those countries be now and where would those people be if the damage hadn't been done to them? And it is no coincidence. And then you have to start looking at every single institution. So if Britain hadn't, and if France and America hadn't been built up on slavery and built up specifically on the damage that it committed to millions of Africans, would they have the position that they have? Would they have the power that they had? And would they and would the institutions, the global institutions, such as the Bretton Woods institutions, where if you look at which has permanent members of the Security Council, where there is no permanent African member or Caribbean member or African majority country, an African majority country, I'm talking about the diaspora as well, so the Caribbean and places in South America. None of them have permanent members on the Security Council, for example. If you look at other ways in which the UN constitutes and other Bretton Woods institutions and standard drawing rights and what have you, they are clearly advantaging the countries who are in power and have power due to the slave trade and due to their colonial history. So if we are to make repair, it is not just about, and this is the difference in charity. Charity is about trying to address the needs of those individual countries. For me, reparations is also doing that, but it's trying to address the power dynamics between those countries. And charity very rarely addresses the power dynamics between those countries. So, or those individuals. It's no point giving charity to different countries if the industries which they build up still needs to trade within a global order which disadvantages them. So reparations is about actually trying to make proper repair so that the actual power dynamics between the different institutions and between different countries and between different individuals is actually addressed. Proper repair is made, not just charity.
Yeah. And is there anything you would want to say about how a process like that could work? Because, we are all doing this interview from the UK where there is a serious proposition that the next prime minister could be a Nigel Farage, where, it feels like an agenda like this feels more politically unattainable than it ever has, and yet at the same time there's also a lot of international momentum around it, so we're in this really odd position. But is there anything you thought about what it would mean or what it could take for countries to get around the table to have a discussion about reparations?
So 2 points, I think. The first point, I've given a few interviews about the book, obviously, and people are saying, but is this really the right time? Because, you've got this right-wing backlash with Trump, and you have this, and Farage could be the next prime minister, and none of them want reparations. And so, first of all, I'd say is that there's never a bad time to talk about justice and equality, and for those in power, who are advantaged by inequality, there is never a good time that they want to talk about giving up power and making sure that. So we need to talk about it in our time. We need to go by our agenda as opposed to waiting for there to be a mythical perfect time when somehow the powers that be in Europe or in America will be more receptive to this. So I would say whoever the next prime minister is, whoever the current prime minister is in Britain, whoever are in the ruling parties in across Europe or in America or Canada or Australia, etc. We need to have this discussion. So we don't need to worry about it. And the analogy that I sometimes make is when there were slave rebellions as Africans have always rebelled against slavery. So when there were slave rebellions in the 1600s, nobody said, "Oh God, what are you doing that for?" I mean, that was a waste of time because it was another 200 years until, we actually got rid of slavery. We rebel. We fight for justice as Africans. We have always fought for justice. And we don't wait for the perfect time, and we don't know how it's going to lead to justice, and whether we get reparations in 100 years' time, whether we get it in 10 years' time, or whether it's another 200 years' time. That doesn't mean we don't stop campaigning for what is right. So that's the first point. Sorry, that's a very long-winded first point. Apologies.
Not at all.
The the second point as to how would it actually work. I absolutely love what CARICOM is doing. I absolutely love what the African Union is doing. So I assume you saw the Ghanaian president talking on Friday. It was Friday or Saturday, campaigning for reparations and advocating for reparations. And what you're seeing is that you're seeing African countries come together. You're seeing the Caribbean countries come together, and they are having a joint up policy to advocate for reparations. And so that's how it's going to come about. And a really good example of that is the Commonwealth Summit of Leaders 2 years ago, where Keir Starmer was arrogant enough to think that he could dictate to the Commonwealth countries that they're not going to talk about reparations. And then the African and Asian countries turned around and said, yeah, it doesn't quite work that way. We want to talk about reparations. We're talking about reparations. And so the idea that any British prime minister on an international stage, or any French prime minister on an international stage, or Spanish prime minister is any longer in a position where they can dictate to African countries when the African countries have come together, or dictate to Caribbean countries when the Caribbean countries have come together, what should be on our agenda, what should be on an international agenda. Those days are long gone, and I think it was a rude awakening to Keir Starmer, and it was a brilliant example that when African and Caribbean countries come together, we can dictate the agenda. And the agenda which CARICOM and the African Union is currently dictating and advocating for is reparations.
Mm-hmm.
So it's on the agenda. And, if Nigel Farage or Keir Starmer want to play King Canute, they can, but the tide's coming in.
Very well said, Marcus. And I think this leads nicely on to maybe you can speak more with your other hat on, which is about the role of the arts. So I'm an actor myself, an actor, if you will, and I believe really passionately about the role of the arts in these very deep, complex issues around social justice, whether domestic, the UK, international, etc. So what role can the arts play in this specific conversation? And what are the effects that you've seen of a book like this, which of course includes a play by Sir Lenny Henry at the very end? So please, you have to finish the book, otherwise you'll miss the play, which is a phenomenal companion to the rest of the book. So what is that role that the arts can play now, perhaps more than ever?
3/4 of the book is a kind of regular non-fiction book about reparations. I say regular, I mean there's jokes, and there's some chapters which are conversations about where Lenny and I talk about Saturday soup. And Lorriann, as someone of Jamaican heritage, I would assume that you know about Saturday soup.
I sent Alex a recipe.
She's given me the recipe. I haven't tried it yet. I'm so sorry, Lorriann. I'll do it tonight.
There is a recipe. There is a recipe in the book as well. By so yeah, it's a tradition where, you know, so me and Lenny would have Saturday soup, and we'd discuss, and so there's lots of different things. But to answer your question, the last third quarter of the book is actually a play, and people are like, why is there a play at the end of your book? And we see it as one whole, right? And sometimes people don't talk about the play, and I always try and bring up the play because we see it as one whole. And in the book, I say we argue in anecdote and we believe in narrative, right? And what I mean by that is that when I argue with you, Alex or Lorriann, on the rare occasions that we'd ever disagree on anything, but if we argued, what happens is that I have a few facts and anecdotes, facts, which I just throw out. And then you have a few facts that you like, a few anecdotes that you like that support your argument, and you throw those out. And we hardly ever get anywhere, right? Because I will always have some facts that will support my argument. You will always have some facts and anecdotes that support your argument, right? But that's how we argue. But our belief, how we see the world, how we believe the world operates, is through a narrative. What is the narrative thread that we believe the world operates in? And the arts, more so than watching current affairs or watching the news and current affairs is kind of anecdote. But the way that we actually see the world, the narrative that we have about the world, is created by the arts, you know? And so the play at the end is giving us a narrative as to how we can actually see the world, you know? And the idea of the arts informing our narrative goes right back. If we take a Western, and I'll be honest with you, I was raised in a Western educational system, which in some ways is problematic, but I'm going to use Western references here. The origins of Western democracy and the origins of Western theatre both come from the same place, and that's not a coincidence. So the origins of Western theatre is ancient Athens, and the origins of Western democracy is ancient Athens, right? And the reason for this, am I going too much on a detour for you, or should I keep going?
This is exactly what we need, Marcus.
There you go, right? And so the reasons for this is that what happened in ancient Greece is that you had a festival, a religious festival, where people would put on plays, and then the people would then literally vote on which play was the best. And at this point, there was no democracy in Athens. It was ruled by a dictator, right? But what you have in voting for different plays, and what plays are different narratives. Mm-hmm. So what you have is people voting on which narrative they like the best. And then when you think about it, all democracy is, when you're voting for people, is which narrative do you think is the best? Is Keir Starmer's narrative a better way of explaining what's happening in the UK, right, than Kemi Badenoch's narrative, or a better narrative than the Lib Dems or Reform or Greens. They are presenting different narratives as to how they see the world. Yeah, they will talk about the different policies, and those are your anecdotes. But in terms of really voting, those are your narratives, right, for the different parties. What do they stand for? What's their narrative belief about the world? And so once you have the narratives, once you have theatre, and you can see the world through different people's eyes because they're putting their narratives forward, democracy is but a hair's breadth away. Right? And so that's why you create theatre, you create the ability to discuss different competing narratives, and then the natural progression, the logical next step is democracy. And you see that in ancient Athens. It is also no coincidence that when dictators come to power in a democracy, the first thing that they do invariably is crack down on who has control of the narratives. You see it all the time with them cracking down with regards to censorship on theatre, on television, on the press, right? And you saw that with regards to McCarthyism, they're attacking cinema, they're attacking the narratives. They want to control the narrative. So having control of the narrative, or being able to express your narrative, which we do in the play in the last third of the book, is so important. So yes, I love and I write nonfiction, but the other hat that I wear is chair of RADA, which is drama. It's one of the most prestigious drama schools in the UK, because I recognise that if we really want to change hearts and minds and really progress the debate on reparations or anything, we need the arts. The arts is absolutely critical. So as an actor, Alex, you are playing a critical role in shaping those narratives. And narratives is how we actually change the narrative.
Couldn't have said it better myself. You're also taking me back to my theatre degree quite a few decades ago to remind us of that historical piece. But I do think, and this podcast is really, it's for a general public audience. So for everyone who's listening, this is what brings us all together, is narrative. You don't need to be an expert in any of these issues to understand them. And I hope that's what we're doing with this today. I think we're close to the end. So Lorriann, over to you.
Can I ask one more question?
Oh, of course. I mean, I wish we could be here all day.
It's on a related point. I think that one of the challenges we have in British society with really engaging with the issue of the transatlantic slave trade is that it feels like it's talked about as an event that happened, and it's a brutal and horrific event. People don't want to engage with it emotionally, and so it's talked about as like just a historical event. And I can remember reading Marlon James's book, The Book of Night Women, which fictionalizes a slave society in which a group of women plan a rebellion. And at the end of the first chapter, I was on the Virgin train going from London to Birmingham. I actually screamed at the end of chapter 1. I think Andrea Levy does a very similar thing in The Long Song, where they use fiction to remind us that these were societies with human beings living life in a set of conditions that they should never have to live life in, but the human life was still existing. So I know that you are interested in the history of pirates and the history of in this history. If there's one story, or if there's one if there's one story that you think should be much more widely known about that period, what would it be?
You mentioned pirates, so there's so many. There's so many. We can talk about how Hamilton is really problematic. So we can talk about that, and I love that story. If we're talking about books, I absolutely love the Known World, which shows the class dynamics in slave society amongst Black people in America. So that's fantastic. But you mentioned pirates, Lorriann.
I did.
And what I love about pirates is the fact that there are different types of freedom. And the pirate freedom, the British Navy had to crack down on piracy in the Caribbean. So we watch the movies Pirates of the Caribbean, and we almost divorce it from the fact that they're in a slave society, you know. And so one of the big things with regards to the piracy was that they were slave economy and the slave trade wasn't really that financially viable while piracy was going around so much. And so so the British Navy had to basically crack down on piracy in order to ensure that the slave trade actually functioned. It's the same way that, trading routes when Somali piracy was at its height in the last, decade or so, or 2 decades. Um, you had to crack down on Somali piracy, or else the trading around the Horn of Africa just couldn't operate properly. It's too much of a risk. And so, similarly, I love pirate stories because they are the if pirates are thriving, then trade around that area is really problematic and can be really difficult. And so I'm not saying the pirates were necessarily doing it for altruistic reasons, in terms of bringing freedom to Africans. But I just loved, and the story which isn't told enough is the story of how the thriving of the pirate economy was really problematic for the slave trade. So I love those. I love pirate stories, and I love pirates. So it's fun. The one thing I did want to say for coming to an end
Mhm.
is that one of the ways the right wing have sometimes tried to criticize the book, and one of the things which I really want to emphasize about the book is that we quote the 18.2 trillion pound figure in the book, which is a figure which comes from the Brattle Report, which was commissioned by the University of the West Indies and sponsored by CARICOM, and is the most comprehensive figure putting a cost on the damage that was done and would be needed to repair, for reparations. And the way that is sometimes framed by the right wing press is that your poor guy in Britain who's struggling to put food on his plate would somehow be paying, trillions of pounds, and all his money would be going to some rich, corrupt guy in some Caribbean country or African country, right? And I think that's a really important narrative that we need to address, right? And the fact of the matter is that if you read the book, and I forget which chapter it is, we talk about the ways in which you could. So, first of all, money is only, and if you look at the different categories of how you make repair, financial repair is only one part of 5 points. If you look at the CARICOM 10-point plan, financial compensation is only 1 point of their 10-point plan, right? But it is a vital point, right? So I don't want to just pretend that we're not talking about financial compensation, right? But in the book, we look at different ways in which economies could actually do that. And we look at the Robin Hood tax, which is a tax on financial transactions. We look at using money which is seized from states that are committing war crimes. And so they're currently talking about this with regards to compensation to Ukraine, seizing the assets of Russian goods, committing war crimes. You can also look at cancelling about debt cancellation. You can look at standard drawing rights and rearranging the Bretton Woods agreements, institutions. So there are lots of different ways in which you would be able to raise those funds, right? Which would not mean taking money from your kind of stereotypical, mythical, hypothetical taxi driver. It's always a taxi driver in these examples, right? Who's struggling to make ends meet, going to some multimillionaire, black multimillionaire giving him trillions. So I think that's a really important narrative, and it's a common device that the right wing often use to pit one set of poor people white poor people against another set of people which are victims of the slave trade, Black and African people. So we need to address that. We need to say that compensation can be raised, and it would not be about raising the income tax of poorer white people. That's just, it's a narrative which the right wing tries to peddle, and I really just wanted to get that across before this podcast ended.
Yeah, thank you for doing that.
100%.
Yeah, thank you for doing that. And I don't know anyone who's ever suggested that income tax targeting the poor is the way to fund reparations. So good to get that.
I'll give you the radio show that I was on yesterday.
Good
I'll
to
send
get
you a
that.
link.
We'll link that for our listeners
Yes,
as well.
we
Be
will.
Interesting.
Thank you. So, Marcus, let's return to our myth, our grounding myth for this episode, which is that countries that receive aid money are entirely responsible for their own problems. What would you say to this?
Of course not. That's a absolutely ridiculous argument. You know, to sustain that argument is inherently racist, because it's inherently saying that somehow countries which have a majority Black, African, somehow we are innately unable to rule ourselves, you know, because, and somehow white countries with a majority white population across Europe and the Americas are just innately able to come to better economic solutions, you know. So you either have to believe that white people and white majority countries are innately better able to rule, which is why they are in a better economic position, and Black people conversely so, you know, which, what if you really unpick that, it doesn't take much to realize that you're on an absolute racist you know, framework if you argue that. Or you need to argue that somehow the structures and the institutions and the history of the world disadvantages majority Black countries. And so if you then take the latter, which would be common sense, you then be like, well, how did those countries get into that position? And you don't really need to think too far or think too hard to realize that countries got into that position due to colonialism and due to the transatlantic slave trade. It's as simple as that. So when you see countries in the Caribbean, or when you see countries in Africa, you know, in economic difficulties, you know, you can, which Western media often does, point to a bad ruler or a corrupt leader, because every country has them. You know, I mean, trust me, look at Britain or look at Italy or look at other parts of Europe. You know, they are very rarely bastions of great economic thinking and ruling. You know, and so you can find examples. Yeah, so if you take a more historical perspective, it's obvious that the repercussions, that we're still living with the repercussions of slavery, that we're still living with the repercussions of colonialism. And that's what this book is all about. That's what the, you know, and I'll do the last plug for the book. That's what the, you know, the big payback, thank you, is all about. It's recognizing that until we make repair, until we address the issues of that were created because of the transatlantic slave trade, because of colonialism, we will never be able to solve the problems of the world. We will never be able to solve the problems of racism. We will never be able to solve the problems of African and Caribbean countries being at a disadvantage compared to their European counterparts. And so reparations is not just about, as we jokingly say, making sure that Lenny Henry can buy a hot tub. You know, it is, which is a joke that runs through the book.
Yep.
And we finish the book by saying he's not getting his hot tub. You know, it is about making sure that we actually have equality, and it is the only way, in my view, that we can finally end racism. Everything else is just tinkering with the symptoms. We have to address the cause, and reparations is the only way that we can address the cause.
I don't think we could have busted this myth any better ourselves. So thank you, everybody. Please pick up this book. It's well worth a read, and gift it to everyone you know.
Hey, I like that.
Marcus, thank you so much. Honestly, this will be the first one of two that we set out, and chef's kiss. It's brilliant.
Please subscribe and take a moment to rate the podcast. You can also follow us on Instagram and YouTube. All details will be in the description below.
You've been amazing, and we've been Take or Give.